So, have you ever felt like a fool? Have you ever felt foolish? A couple of times in my life, I might have set the record, for just making a fool of myself, making mistakes. And of course, when you do things like trip over yourself or make a mistake in driving your car, it's always when people are around, right? There are many times in my life I've felt foolish. So what we're going to start out doing is laughing at the expense of other people. If you go online and do a search for the phrase, "you had just one job," you're going to find things like this. There's a ton of them online. Or whoever put up these signs. It can happen to anybody. It can happen if you haven't had your coffee or whatnot. Could be on the road. Could be on a cake. Now, these are the funny ones. Because you can hear the phone conversation, right? They call and they say, what do you want on your cake? And they say 30 with stars and sprinkles around it. So the cake decorator is a little bit too literal, right? We've all made fools of ourselves, and it's part of being human. Now I had to include this. You're going to leave thinking, oh, he never grew up, or something like that. But one of my favorite videos is this surveillance tape right here. Now, here's the door is right there, but watch on the right side of the screen. And then you just got to play it off somehow, right? Out he goes. Yeah, I'm out of here. So now hang on. You might not have seen it. Let's play that again. Oh, shoot. It's going to freeze up. I needed to see it one more time just for me. It froze up. That's all right. Now, I've done that, by the way, at least once. I don't remember where I was, but walked into a glass door. It's not a door, a glass window. Sure, we've all felt foolish. One of my questions today is, have you ever felt foolish because of your faith? Have you ever felt foolish because of what you believe or what you believe your faith is teaching you to do? I've had times like that. I mean, one would be in college marching band. I know. College marching band. But in my section, the baritone section, to be a part of the group, apparently, one of your first priorities had to be parties and drinking and things like that. And that was not one of my priorities. And of course, when people learned that I was a Christian, a church boy, and I was going into ministry and all this, they couldn't get enough of that, right? As supposedly the only one in the section. Have you ever felt foolish for your faith? Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians, the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it's the power of God. Now, first of all, we have to be clear on, what kind of fool are we talking about? If it's actually a good thing to be fools for the gospel, we have to be clear because, do we need less fools in the world or more fools? Depends on what you're talking about, right? Sometimes verses like this and the verse where Jesus tells his disciples, people might hate you because of me. People might hate you and ridicule you and persecute you because of me. We have to be clear what side of that we're on. Because sometimes as Christians, we do truly foolish things, and then when we're criticized for it, we say, oh, see, they told me I was going to be thought a fool. The Bible reminds us that you have to be clear what side of power and privilege you're on, and as Paul was writing, he said, we may be criticized for preaching and living the gospel. He didn't say that if we were, whenever we are criticized, then we're automatically preaching and living the gospel. Not necessarily. What does it mean to be a fool for the gospel? What kind of foolishness is Paul talking about? Here's a quote from an Episcopal priest named Ian Markham. He said, "From time to time, Christians should stand back and acknowledge how odd our faith looks. For Christians claim that the most important divine action in history is the humiliating death of a poor Jew at the hands of an occupying power, aka the crucifixion. The central Christian symbol is the ancient equivalent of the hangman's noose or the electric chair. Instead of a dramatic demonstration of God's power, we have weakness and failure affirmed. It is odd." In other words, foolishness for the gospel doesn't put us up on a pedestal, doesn't force the faith on other people through political power or whatnot. Foolishness for the gospel actually gets us out of the way. It's not self-aggrandizing. And it's living a different way, a way different from what common sense, worldly wisdom might have us think. Let's do some brief storytelling. I tried to think of people who I would consider fools for the gospel. Foolish in the sense that Paul was talking about. You know, that we're faithfully following Christ and doing what he wants us to do, but many others might think it doesn't make sense or looks foolish. First, Mother Teresa, one of my favorite people. If you read her published letters, now I felt a little guilty reading her letters because they were published against her will, but we have them now. And I read them, and when she was at her former placement in a monastic setting or whatnot, she begged and pleaded for a harder life. I'm serious. She begged and pleaded to go minister in the streets of Calcutta, a place so poor and so dirty and so out of shape at the time that after she had been there for several years, she was having a crisis of faith. But she begged and pleaded to go to the streets. Foolishness for the gospel. Or, to go back a long way, St. Francis of Assisi, who lived in the 13th century. Now, at that time, remember, the church was very wealthy, very powerful, and the Crusades were going on. So not only was the church wealthy and powerful, they were also oppressive, doing violence in God's name. Something many religions have done, not just one. St. Francis of Assisi grew up in a wealthy family, was part of a wealthy church, had everything he wanted, but he had been reading about Jesus and kind of figured out something different is happening here. He ended up leaving his wealthy family, leaving the wealthy church, and felt called to start his own Franciscan order, as we call it now. And it was a group of people who lived a simple life, only what they needed, quote, daily bread, as we say every Sunday in the Lord's Prayer. And they went to the places and the people that were forgotten, ordinary villages, to go there and share the love of God. But let's go modern day a little bit. During my sabbatical last summer, I visited this church. It's one of several churches I visited. It's Redeemer Lutheran Church in Minneapolis. I was inspired by their story because they told me of, 15, 20 years ago, their neighborhood, the Harrison neighborhood, had really been declining. And all the other churches in the area had moved out, gone to the suburbs. I mean, if you want to be a well-off, prosperous church, you go to the suburbs. But they stayed. The only church in the area that did not pack up and move out. And it wasn't just by default. They weren't saying, okay, we don't feel like moving. They made an intentional decision to be a neighborhood church. And I'll tell you what struck me. When you talk to the leadership, you can tell that they don't think their church has walls. I mean, they do not think of Redeemer Lutheran Church as their property within the four walls. They really think of Redeemer Lutheran Church as the Harrison neighborhood. and they've built homes and created job opportunities and actually dozens of programs that they've started in their neighborhood. This is Northern Lighthouse Church in Lincoln, Nebraska, very northern end of Lincoln, Nebraska. Small church. Nobody's really heard of it. I hadn't heard of it. If you look, their sanctuary's not that big. There's maybe 70, 80 people in there. But they, every Sunday, bus in around 40 prisoners from a work-release prison and bring them into worship. And they also have ex-prisoners who worship with them and eat with them, the homeless, as well as middle class and other well-off individuals. But, some people they will tell you, some people have visited their church and kind of decided, no thanks, I'm a little intimidated or put off by some of these people. But they say, this is what we're going to be about. We're going to be a place of worship and welcome for people on the fringe, people who are rough around the edges. By worldly wisdom, not something you do if you want to be well off. Or finally, if you read the news, you recognize this face. Kayla Mueller is the American aid worker who went to Syria. She was captured and ultimately killed by ISIS. And they published some news stories about her. I don't know if you've read some of her story, but here's an excerpt from the news story. Images of children suffering in the early stages of Syria's ongoing civil war prompted Mueller to leave her home in Prescott, Arizona in December 2012 to work with the Danish Refugee Council and the humanitarian organization Support to Life to help refugees. According to a family spokesperson, Kayla found the work heartbreaking and compelling. She wrote letters that some of these letters the family gave permission to publish. Here's a letter she wrote before she left. I will always seek God. Some people find God in church. Some people find God in nature. Some people find God in love. I find God in suffering. I've known for some time what my life's work is, using my hands as tools to relieve suffering. And then her parents received a letter from her in 2014. She was in ISIS captivity, and the way she got the letter to them was that she had given it to other fellow prisoners and said, if you get out before I do, please mail this to my parents. And they got at least one mailed, and here's part. You really need to read the whole thing online if you can, but here's part of it. I remember Mom always telling me that all in all, in the end, the only one you really have is God. I have surrendered myself to our Creator because literally there was no one else. I have been shown in darkness, light, and have learned that even in prison, one can be free, and I am grateful. Grateful? In ISIS captivity? Foolishness, right? Now, I read every letter I could find that they've published, and there's only a few, so there could be others. But I read through all of her letters looking for something, and I couldn't find it. Couldn't find one word in any of her letters of hate or vengeance for her captors. Not a word. She talks about being able to serve God. She talks about being grateful. Not one word of hate or vengeance for her captors. I've heard way more hate and vengeance from people in this country who are most likely going home to their family tonight. But Kayla, not one word. I hear a lot of hate and vengeance. And I guess we're afraid that if we don't express that, we're saying that what people are doing is okay. I don't know if you know this, but it's possible to defend yourself without hate or vengeance in your heart. Paul wrote, "Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world?" And so as I thought about these people, I thought about, what do they have in common? What are the characteristics of these people that I've kind of lifted up as being foolish for the gospel? What are we looking at here? A couple of things as we close. Number one, they transcend self-preservation. Because see, if we believe that the highest goal is to avoid death or struggle or persecution or anything like that, there's some things we might miss. Remember, Paul said the cross is foolishness for those who are perishing, but the power of God to those being saved. The truth of the matter is, we're all actually perishing. Here's what Richard Niebuhr wrote. He said, "We are indeed coming through disaster, but we will not be lost. The cross does not deny the reality of death. It reinforces it. It denies its finality." Here's another pastor and theologian, Adam Eckhart. "This false wisdom of self-preservation seeks to protect us from the inevitability of death and, in the meantime, from the threat of outsiders and even our apparent friends. Any deviation from worldly wisdom is viewed as foolishly exposing ourselves to attack from the hostile world." Self-preservation would say, no, you don't want prisoners in your church. Self-preservation would say, don't go to Syria. Are you nuts? Self-preservation would say, get out of that neighborhood. Not these people. Number two, they're willing to abandon tradition when it is preventing the love of God and neighbor. Jesus did this all the time. It's what got him in trouble. And when he was cleansing the temple, the movies, when you watch this scene in the Jesus movies, Jesus often comes in and he sees the selling going on in the temple and he's shocked. And then anger grows on his face. The problem with that is that he wouldn't have been shocked. That had been going on for a long, long time. If you came to the temple for a special feast, you had to have a sacrifice to participate in worship. And if you're coming 8 hours or more, it's kind of hard to bring a dove or a lamb or something like that. So in order to get the people what they needed, they sold them in the temple. Had been going on for a long time. Supposedly the problem was Jesus saw things a little differently and said, that's what they're trying to do, may have started out with good intentions, but if you're selling things in order to be able to participate in worship, if you can't participate in worship unless you've bought this, who does that leave out? The poor. Nobody had thought of that, supposedly. Number three, these fools for the gospel embrace weakness because it reveals the power of God. Sometimes that's what we feel foolish about, the things we can't do, the things we mess up. But Paul said, for Christ's sake, we can delight in weaknesses and insults and hardships because when that stuff is going on, God has the opportunity to show up. That's when the power of God can be displayed in our lives. And finally, they see God everywhere. In Vacation Bible School, we call this God sightings. The psalm has great poetry. It says, the heavens and the skies proclaim God, but they speak without a sound or a word. Their voice is never heard, yet their message has gone throughout the earth. The good news is that we don't have to be somebody else. We don't have to be Mother Teresa or Kayla Mueller or a church here or a church there. The good news is that God has a calling for us as individuals, for us as a church, But the challenging part is that usually the call of Christ requires things of us that some might consider foolish. The call of Christ requires us to get ourselves out of the way. You know, the church in Minneapolis said, we're not going to put ourselves in the way of what God's trying to do in this neighborhood. We're going to be a part of it. The gospel can drive us deeper into our communities, closer with our family, and sometimes away from the things that we might want for ourselves.